Good morning, and welcome to the second Comet Corner session. This is a new virtual series created by the UT Dallas Office of Research and in partnership with the schools across our campus to host chats with some of our notable alumni and hear how they have taken their research out into the world and made an impact. My name is Enrica Ziller, Outreach and Events Manager in the Office of Research at the University of Texas at Dallas. As we move through today's session, I invite you to post questions in the chat box for our guest speakers to discuss. Moderating our discussion today is Dr. Jessica Murphy, Dean of Undergraduate Education and Associate Professor of Literature at UT Dallas. Her research focuses on early modern literature and culture, and her publications include articles, chapters in edited collections, and a book, Virtuous Necessity, Conduct Literature and the Making of a Virtuous Woman in Early Modern England. Dr. Murphy?
Thank you. I am pleased to introduce to you one of our outstanding UT Dallas alumni, Dr. Susan Power Bratton. Dr. Bratton is a professor at the Department of Environmental Sciences at Baylor University and holds a PhD in plant ecology from Cornell University and a PhD in interdisciplinary humanities from the University of Texas at Dallas. Dr. Bratton has published 4 books and over 50 book chapters and articles concerning religion and the environment. In 2014, her book, The Spirit of the Appalachian Trail, received recognition as a Choice Outstanding Academic title. In 2015, the International Society for Science and Religion elected Dr. Bratton as a fellow. She is currently completing a text, Religion and the Environment, for Taylor and Francis Group. Dr. Bratton is a regular attendee of UTD events and was recently featured for her support of the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies and UT Dallas in the UT Dallas magazine. Dr. Bratton, welcome.
Hello. My topic for today is teaching religion and the environment, tapping interdisciplinary research. I've been working on a text aimed at undergrads and lower level graduate students, and part of the challenge of doing this is combining research from different fields. Science and social science identify environmental impacts, and they define and prioritize environmental issues. But the question is, how does the synthesis with these fields depict the interface with religion? And there's a challenge here. It's necessary to avoid misrepresenting the functions and contributions of religion to environmental problem solving, and also to be open about any conflicts or dissonance between religion and science. Most texts on related topics organized by religion. This is great for cosmological comparison, but it often detaches the topic from its scientific framing. It may present religions in the past tense only, which is a mistake when you're dealing with current environmental problem solving. And in some cases, it's potentially biased against the Abrahamic faith. I can think of examples where Islam received no coverage, or where some of the critique was tacitly anti-Semitic. One of the questions here is, are we in the past or the present? How did industrial religion interact with the environment? And what are the challenges today? If we look at traditional or indigenous religions in the present tense, in the environmental presence, some of them are suffering in major ways from our current environmental problems. Polynesian religions, for example, face sea level rise, ocean acidification, and coral reef decline. So I went ahead and organized the book, not by religion, but by scientific topic. And this is a new approach. The early sections, however, do align the history of religions with science. For instance, an early chapter deals with consumptive resources. It deals then also in detail with animism. The chapter on agriculture discusses the rise of pro-social religions, which would include the world religions, and a chapter on industrialization deals with modernity and religion. Each of the separate sections of the volume have a theoretical topic they cover, such as cultural discourse, or in the case of industrialization, materialism and technology relative to religion. The book continues with other issues that are defined primarily by science and social science. Included are urban planning, pollution and health, and climate and energy. And I might point out that urban planning is usually missed by most discussions of this topic. And each of these has a theoretical discussion. There's a discussion of the concept of Gaia from a scientific framework. There is a discussion of anti-scientific ideology and climate change denial. I'm just going to pick out 3 problems to discuss. There are more that are dealt with in this work, but take a look at how to create a dialogue which will allow you to switch perspectives by fields. The first problem I'm going to cover is, how do religions manage natural resources, and why do they sometimes appear to do a better job? They're less environmentally degrading than today's scientific management. And this is a Bali water temple scene. Many religious systems are quite sophisticated ecologically. An example that's often cited is the salmon fisheries of the Pacific Northwest and their pre-colonial aspects. The religious approaches divided the responsibility for the fisheries by clans or families, so individual groups had territories they controlled. The sacred narratives and instructional stories about salmon include the ill effects of wastage, disrespect, and greed. The iconography is not just about salmon, but it's about the relationships among fishers and a people to other species. The instruction in the religious narratives includes examples of improper use of technologies like building dams that would prevent the fish from moving upstream. And the religions of the Pacific Northwest, many of them have a first fish ceremony that halts fishing right at the head of each salmon run. And this allows escapement. And each of the salmon runs is genetically distinct. They're also very tuned to their local geography. So this is actually conserving genetic diversity within the fishing resource. And the totem pole here tells the story of Raven and Salmon Woman. Raven married Salmon Woman, and there was a food shortage, and she invented a basket, or miraculously produced a basket, that had salmon in it every morning. They had a little marital discord, and Raven threw her out, and she took the basket with her. And Raven went to look for her when he realized he had nothing to eat. But the story of Raven and Salmon Woman, and she turns into nebulous mist, and he never recovers her in the tale, is also about how people have to work together to maintain the fishery. I term this kind of religious approach to natural resources as having high ecodimensionality. The spatial and temporal aspects of the religion are very, very tightly tied to the environment. The myths and arts treat salmon and other species as morally considerable. Ravens and coyotes become sages, and salmon have nations of their own. The community, the human community, benefits not just from sustainable harvest, but from shared celebrations and cultural enrichment. And the shared rituals enhance cooperation among people. They reduce cheating, a lot better than simple regulations do, and they prevent resource abuse. Ecodimensionality is also a feature of world religions, and I think one of the problems with some of the texts is they treat animist religions and indigenous religions as a little bit too different from some of the world religions that have been long in place. And an example are the Hindu water temples on Bali. There's a little Buddhist influence here too. They organize irrigation systems on a watershed basis that extends from lakes and volcanic calderas to mid-elevations to the sea. The farmers divide into units around a local water temple and around a local irrigation network. They have a system of fallow and water releases that provides natural fertilization through microbes. and they don't over-apply fertilizer through the system. The fallow also prevents pest outbreaks. They do have a chief priest, a priesthood that adjudicates disputes, but most of the water management is bottom-up. It comes from each of these local water temple units. Thus, it ensures adequate allocation. It can adjust to weather and other changes, and provides timely responses to environmental fluctuations. And in this particular case, when modern agricultural science first arrived, it tinkered with the system, tried to introduce commercial fertilizers, tried to synchronize the water releases, and basically caused pest outbreaks and over-fertilization that resulted in algal blooms on coral reefs. And it's not that science can't learn from the system, they didn't investigate first. This is a case where religion has actually high ecodimensionality and an intelligent organizational system for sharing resources. The Abrahamic faith can also express high ecodimensionality. A very good example of this is Islamic gardens and patios. They express the basic principle of divine unity, as does Islamic urban design. They incorporate the teachings of the Quran and use sophisticated water conservation technologies like rooftop collection and local application. There are little irrigation channels here in the orange tree patio, which is at a site in Cordoba in Spain that was originally a mosque. It's now a Christian cathedral. But Islamic design understands microclimates, the value of shade and water use. They use many fountains and careful positioning of walls. And when you look at the design of urban housing or courtyards for mosques, they provide spaces for family socializing, for prayer and studying sacred texts. And the household gardens incorporate beauty with the edible, and they encourage wildlife. So this is another fine example of ecodimensionality in a monotheistic framework, and it's sustainable technology friendly as well. Today, we see religious groups participating in a number of different forms of sustainable development. I just threw in two examples here. Here are community members surveying sacred groves in Igbo land to try and determine which species are present. The groves are declining a little bit due to agricultural intrusion, so communities have been organized to assist with this. And Arosha is a Christian organization. This is Arosha Canada, where interns are surveying a stream corridor on one of their properties for the endangered Salish sucker, and they're participating with the provincial environmental agencies in determining the health of the fishery. Another problem the book takes on is how do religions interact with modernity and industrialization concerning the material and the sacralization of technology. And sacralization of technology is a very ancient practice. It goes back to stone tools. This is the Polar Express running out of Bertram, Texas, which is Santa getting together with a railroad. Protestantism in early modernity desacralized candles, Yule logs, and buildings. The radical Reformation stripped altars, removed candles, discouraged pagan retentions, quote pagan retentions like Yule logs, and emphasized an ethos of simplicity, making houses look like homes. This is not necessarily a low environmental impact approach. Calvinist Friends and Baptists invested in mines and manufacturing, and ultimately in coal, canals, and railroads. Often forgotten, but I think very demonstrative, is the degree to which Western Christian cultures sacralized or at least gave moral efficacy to industrial innovations such as the railroads that allowed penetration and civilizing of new territories, be it through the American deserts or the African plains. Railroads carry missionaries and Christian settlers into the hinterlands and bring the rural products back to fuel economies. Railroad companies have long incorporated religious iconography, either along their tracks, on their advertising. They've incorporated sacred features. And one of the great examples of this are the railroad stations in London, which have borrowed sacred architecture. This has also happened in the US, and stations like Union Station in Washington, which looks like the Pantheon. But this is St. Pancras, which could easily be mistaken for a Gothic town hall or church. I'm sure it has been many times. You'll notice the terminal there on the right. And an even a better example is Paddington Station, which has borrowed Islamic architecture. And it's also a beautiful example. It's been recently restored of industrial building design here in primarily cast iron, with the pillars and the arches imitating the great mosques. Sometimes they take this a little bit far, but the stations convey the meta-narrative of empire and of techno-industrial culture as the pinnacle of civilization. And let me point out that they're on the consumer end of the chain. This isn't sacralizing the mines or the smelters, which was done in many iron-producing cultures. This is sacralizing the place where consumers and the board are going to end up using the facilities. Another example of this is the combination of light shows, religious light shows or religious holidays, with symbols of technological progress. In 1923, for example, Calvin Coolidge lit the first outdoor national Christmas tree on the White House lawn, which is pretty thin with 250 bulbs. It's low-key compared to light displays today in grapevine. But this occurred at a time when electric lighting was replacing gas in US cities and homes, and many rural regions still did not have electrical service. So it combines the Christmas season with a concern for national technological progress. Today, we see projects like attempting to fuel the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree with solar panels, which they can partially carry the electric load of it, metamorphosing this dialogue, this symbolism, from national progress more towards national responsibility. And this is just one of our local light shows. This is the Pedernales Electrical Cooperative sharing the truth and love of Christ's birth through a very fine display on their lawn, covering escarpment live oaks. This is not just a Christian issue, though. Other religions are facing the same quandary over how to deal with light or flame or electricity as a symbol. This is Diwali Celebration from Houston, which has an electrical company and some communication companies as sponsors. Doesn't really tell you here whether the energy is green or not, but I think there's a trend towards greening these celebrations. Great, Bertram, again, with the Polar Express, teaching children the true value of Christmas. The third problem I'd like to look at is how religions are addressing climate and sea change. Obviously, religions are on the receiving end. It's not just a matter of whether they're going to tell us what's ethically right to do. They are victims of our current technologies. There have been some recent studies looking at religion and climate skepticism, or climate skepticism as a cultural phenomenon. Carrie Norgard conducted interviews in Norway. She rejected the idea of hierarchy of needs explanations as causing climate change denial, or more inaction in that particular Norwegian case. It wasn't, I need to drive my car. She didn't think political alienation was a factor. Her study suggested that climate change is generating ontological security issues because of its risk. Norway has benefited from North Sea oil. People don't like being bad people. They like the income from the oil. They like their economy being healthy. So it tends to lead to inaction. Robin Veldman has recently investigated evangelical groups specifically and has looked at the question of apocalypticism, or millennialist views among evangelicals, and points out that many millennials are actually cool. They're not very concerned about climate change. Climate does create an issue concerning the authority of God, because climate change suggests that something other than God might control the outcomes for the Earth as a planet, and that's, of course, an important biblical theme for Christians. Feldman, I think, very rightly suggests the embattled mentality, contesting the liberal takeover of universities, the government interface with the educational systems, and the role of elites, including scientists, is a factor in climate change denials, and it is a form of political alienation. She looked at the case when evangelical leaders, some of them megachurch leaders, many of them from the universities, issued the Evangelical Climate Initiative in 2006, which was pro taking action concerning clean energy. That when other evangelicals who were active with the media and megachurches used their platforms to forward climate skepticism as the biblical view. So we can see that there are factors politicizing this among American evangelicals, particularly. Evangelicals and others, including some conservative Roman Catholics, do participate in conservative think tanks that forward science skepticism in general, and they team up over the free market economy. So there's a large element here of ideology in their discussions. A study in 2014 found that Americans believe that they're insulated from climate damages, that they're going to fall harder on other countries, particularly on developing nations, and that skepticism is strongly aligned with political party membership more than with theological belief. The Tea Party at that time had the most. The Tea Party is now partially defunct. Republicans a little less, but far more than Democrats, who had the fewest skeptics. But let's look at the opposite side of this and look at Christian organizations. I'm just going to show a few examples. I could show Islamic organizations just as easily, or another major religion, or Buddhism, but I work on Christianity here to look at this climate skepticism question. This is St. James Piccadilly, a Christopher Wren design. It really is about 2 blocks from the statue of Eros in the center of Piccadilly Circus. In 2003, St. James was ahead of its time in installing photovoltaic cells on a roof, and they've done this on a roof of an administration building rather than interfere with the historic architecture. They have thereby reduced their carbon emissions, and they demonstrate very high eco-dimensionality. They celebrate an outdoor eco-liturgy once a month. They sponsor educational speakers. They support rituals like blessing the bicycles, which I would really like to attend. They schedule one-day eco-pilgrimages to urban green spaces and to sustainable communities, and they've joined in with other faiths in Earth Hour in downtown London. They have an energy meter set up in the center of the church. This is just one of their posters from one of their educational events. And their members and neighbors benefit in multiple ways, including their green program for an outdoor green space right in the middle of central London. There are a fair trade church. So they're very integrated with their neighborhood. A second and very dramatic example of working with historic architecture and installing photovoltaics is Gloucester Cathedral with its 11th century nave and Gothic choir. It is the site where Edward II is in his crypt. And some of you have probably seen some shots from it on Harry Potter films. But joining with My Power UK, they wrestled with the issue of their lead roof, the original from the Middle Ages, and developed a track system over the top of it so they didn't have to drill into it, and have actually put solar array on top of that gorgeous nave. The Church of England is not always totally in line with the government here, but you can see that from the ground, and if you're a tourist, you don't even notice the photovoltaics because of the high pediment. They haven't interfered with their architectural views at all. And they've integrated this into their ritual life. This is the Dean blessing the solar array. Again, a very good example of eco-dimensionality. To take on an American Protestant institution, and I'm now using Baylor University as a study subject and not as my employer, interestingly enough, the George W. Truett Seminary was the first LEED certified building on campus, the first one to adopt environmentally sustainable technologies intentionally as part of the original design. And this was done in the 1990s before I came to the university to serve as chair of environmental sciences for Baylor. And I think that most people don't realize that this has symbolic importance. This was built during a period when there was battling among Southern Baptists and regional Baptist conventions concerning conservative forces versus more moderate forms of biblical interpretation. In the early 20th century, Truett, as a namesake, was the pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, and he was also very important in raising funds for Baptist schools, orphanages, and hospitals. He had a high sense of civic duty. The building, certified in 2009 with its embedded chapel, is a symbolic synthesis of Baptist commitment to participation in local civic welfare and the centrality of shared worship and preaching in Baptist life. The second most important religion at Baylor is, and then the university now has a LEED certified practice facility in football and won a recognition for innovation. And in 2007, Baylor picked up a wind power contract to power the university with green energy with an anticipated savings of $2 million per year. They hired a sustainability coordinator. The new business school has a higher level of LEED certification, and they've worked in other related areas like wetland restoration and community gardening. But it's very important to understand in these positive responses that Baptist polity encourages ties to civic organizations and to the greater community. And that's one of the reasons for these responses. It actually is embedded in the religious thinking. And I think Baylor recognizes that it's very important to where Texas is going, to not just stay with fossil fuels, but to invest in new sustainable forms of energy. It's part of Texas's economic futures. One more Christian example here is the African and Methodist Episcopal Church climate statement. I think the Black church is often overlooked in terms of their environmental contributions, but this is integrated with the importance of civil rights to the African Methodist Episcopal Church. It was the home church of Rosa Parks, for example. But just to briefly read this, climate change hurts God's creation and people. Black people are unduly impacted. The health of children, elderly, and those with chronic diseases like asthma are at greater risk. Our faithful in the Caribbean, Africa, and rural communities are suffering from floods, drought, and disease. The AME is supporting climate policies and action that will move us away from dirty fuels and make us sick, and move towards safe, clean energy. Just to look at the cases where religion is responding more positively here, and the picture is a garden that is a social service garden. I was one of the team that helped get the university to let us install it, and it provides greens for campus kitchen, which salvages unused food from the university dining halls and contributes them to local ministries like Salvation Army, Food for the Homeless. But these climate and sustainability programs are consistent with denominational policy and express core values for the religious groups. This is often in subtle ways, like placing the solar array, the energy meter, or the LEED certified architecture over, around, or adjoining central worship spaces, or in the case of the AME, the direct support for civil rights in their climate statement. Overall, the environmental programming contributes to community life and welfare. It provides pleasant social spaces, saves money, enhances celebrations, encourages community members to work together, and in the case of colleges and universities, engages students in projects related to community welfare. There's high eco-dimensionality in these programs, multiple linkages among environmental programming and other missions, goals, ministries. These include sports and recreation, the many pilgrimages of St. James Piccadilly, and home missions. And these programs enhance ontological security and offer constructive approaches to community futures. And if you looked at similar programs in Islam or Buddhism, I think you'd see many of the same features. So I'll end with that. Part of the message of the book is either science or religion can act as a villain, as a helpless bystander, or as a hero, as a really constructive contributor to solving environmental problems.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bratton. Thank you for your excellent talk. I love that ending because it kind of is also a call. You've given us a lot to think about with regard to the interface between religion and the environment. Your topic is really robust, and I'm wondering if we can start off by talking a little bit about your choice to follow up your plant ecology work with humanities work. What inspired you to make that choice, and how has it informed your work as a scholar and a teacher?
Well, I started before I came to UTD, and partially it was that I think there was so much public misconception about this. And as I think you can tell from what I just said, I'm really against having religion separated from environmental problem solving. I think that we need to have religion involved. And I originally started to publish on the topic in the 1980s when scientists were reaching out to people from the other side, and I became interested in environmental ethics and took a certificate in the area, and then eventually went on to the PhD at UTD to back up my work.
Excellent. Thank you. I have a question about the arrangement of your new book. So when you started in the beginning, you talked a little bit about the way knowledge was constructed in previous texts on the book. You know, you go from this religion does it this way to this religion looks at it this way, and so on, and almost as if you're giving priority listing to the different religious traditions. So arranging by scientific topic, what you're doing can help us understand not only what's at stake, but also the ways that our former beliefs about what is at stake were and are shaped by the ways that we have been told the story. So can you talk a little bit about how you hope that this organization might change received notions?
Well, there are several purposes in it. One is to make sure that environmental coverage is more thorough. And as important as climate change is, some recent work along this line has focused almost entirely on atmospheric change and has left other issues like toxics, urban planning, which is actually quite important to resolving atmospheric issues, out of the discussion. And I also think that that's dropped some very important contributions made by, in the US, by minority groups and by indigenous religions, such as leadership in the urban planning areas, and Black churches and people like Cesar Chavez have been very important in leadership concerning toxins and exposure of people who might be vulnerable. And this often doesn't get covered at all. It has a very strong religious framing. Cesar Chavez, for example, used Mexican popular piety to help build solidarity among his United Farm Workers and with some of their supporters who were from outside the United Farm Workers. And I think these are important stories, not just because you want to give people credit for what they've done, but they really help you to figure out things that might work to build common cause, to get people together on solving the problems. So that's part of the purpose of doing it that way, is to make sure I get that good coverage. And it actually makes it easier to choose examples from among different religions and put them together so you can see them in different cultural settings. The pollution chapter, for example, uses not just Cesar Chavez and some examples from Black churches, but it also looks at battling river pollution in India and Hindu responses to doing that use Hindu iconography.
Right. Can you think of other examples, kind of like the pollution one, where you're bringing together traditions that normally would be on two opposite ends of a book, you know, where one is in one chapter and one would normally be in another?
Well, I actually, in the first chapter, which has a lead on Standing Rock, despite the fact that Native American religion and more or less pan-Native American religion is a very important center, a symbolic center of what happened at Standing Rock concerning the resistance to the pipeline, there were also a large number of participants from other religious backgrounds at Standing Rock, and many of the Native Americans who participated at Standing Rock are actually Christian or belong to other religious traditions. So I started the book right off with that discussion about the interface and some examples of how different people responded and how they respected each other's traditions.
Standing Rock is a really powerful example to start with, I bet. that's a really good place to begin. So one of the things you just mentioned was urban planning and the way that structures are created. I was really struck by the ways that architecture can express the interface of religion and industrialization that you talked about. When you think about this in the context of national progress on the one hand and national responsibility maybe on the other, as you put it, I really like that example of Gloucester Cathedral that you gave. What are some of the ways that you address this in the book, that religion works to influence in this balance?
Well, actually, in the urban planning chapter, one of my early leads is on Islam and its successes in the past, and then the fact that modernity has provided some significant challenges, and so is technology. A simple example is a proper Islamic household has room for the extended family in many cultural settings, but modern one-bedroom apartments built out of steel and concrete just don't meet these kinds of standards. So there are younger and current Islamic architects who are struggling to try and put Islamic values back into urban planning and are dealing with some fairly difficult environmental constraints while they're doing this.
That's a really good example. So I have two kind of COVID-19 related questions, because I think that there's a lot of, I'm hearing a lot of echoes in some of the things you're talking about and some of the conversations we've had about the ways that COVID-19 has maybe raised questions about inequities across the globe. So the 2014 study that you mentioned about Americans believing that they're insulated from damage due to climate change in some ways. If that study were done now, do you think the results would look a little differently, or what might we be able to learn from such a questioning?
I think the general trend is a better American public comprehension of the problem of climate change and of globalization. But I also think in COVID, you're seeing some entrenched American resistance to wanting to deal with the global reality. Our relationship with the World Health Organization taking some of us quite by surprise that anyone would think of dropping us out of it at this particular point in time when we would most need to be connected to everyone else. So I think on the climate end, there's been better understanding, but I'm not convinced that nationally we're completely learning our lessons at the moment.
Thank you. And then on a kind of a lighter note, so your images suggest that you often travel to the areas that you're studying. That image of St. Pancras, for example, was just so gorgeous, and it was clear that you were there and you were loving the moment. Now with travel currently restricted, are there some ways that you're adapting your methods to make sure that you're still able to learn about the areas that you're studying?
Well, actually, I was intending to go to Israel at the end of spring term and visit with an institute there that throws water and other sustainability courses for a multi-religious and multinational cadre. And they specialize in questions like transboundary water management, which is very important in the Jordan River Valley and the Middle East in general. And so instead of attending, the trip was canceled, needless to say, which was really too bad because I was going to have a great experience. We're going to go to Jordan and meet some of the officials there, and we were going to go meet some Palestinian officials and also visit some projects in Palestinian communities for improvement of both energy and water access. But instead, I have been attending their seminars online. For example, and they've been doing a pretty good job of connecting with experts in Israel, the United States, and elsewhere, and running panels while I'm stuck at home. And so I've been tuning in on the discussions there about current water issues. Excellent. That would just be one example. Yeah. I happen to like online sessions and teaching and meetings. In the right context, I think it's great. You can do all kinds of things you couldn't ordinarily do.
Yeah. And it might even be opening up some opportunities for you to have these conversations with leaders and with groups that you may not have had it, in your schedule to travel to. Okay, so we are starting to get to the questions that are from the audience, and I am going to do my best here. So we have a question here from Sophia. Indigenous religions have been characterized as being highly tied to the environment, and colonialism traditionally villainized indigenous practices. Has colonialism affected the interface of Christianity and the environment, particularly in the United States?
That's a rather complicated question. The first thing I would say about it is that on the indigenous side, there's still a major problem of discourse with mainstream culture. And it's not just with Christianity, it's also with environmentalism, when it tends to be kind of your white mainstream type of environmentalism that has very set goals. And there have been some conflicts over indigenous religion in that context. One of the great examples in the book covers it is when the macaw tried to reintroduce whaling, just taking 4 whales a year. It's for ritual use. It's also an issue to other cultures in that region. There's a fairly major standoff about it that's never been resolved to the satisfaction of the macaw nation right on the coast of Washington. And so I think there's an ongoing dissonance there. I think that Christianity is becoming more self-reflective about its roles in colonialism, but we still have some issues in how we organize multi-religious dialogues that are centered on Christianity in the United States. Liberal Protestantism co-evolved with modernity, and it tends to very easily see science as a mission, which makes it a good leader in cases where you're trying to introduce more scientific thought, but it can lead to a certain misunderstanding about religions that may have different traditions. One of the old misunderstandings is the meaning of sacred space. Liberal Protestantism does not have a history of having a good grasp of Native American sacred space and its meaning and how it's organized, and has often backed legislation that was not in favor of protecting Native or indigenous sacred spaces. So I think we're at a point where we have a kind of a new dialogue going, and you don't want one religious view to dominate over the others. But I'd see our current issues as being who's going to lead, who's going to do training, whether, for instance, say if you have a liberal, environmental NGO, or I call the religious ones RENGOs, religious environmental NGO, if most of the membership is white Protestant, are they going to understand the heritage of the Islamic community in the same area? Are they going to understand the heritage of the Black churches? Are they going to understand the heritage of the indigenous peoples? And can you get some degree of cooperation while recognizing the individuality of these religious preferences, or in some cases, very deep and worthy heritages? I think I'm on the topic here.
Yes. No, I mean, it's a very complicated question. So we do have an anonymous question as well, who begins with, thank you, Dr. Bratton. So when you discuss the religious aspects, do you also discuss or consider social and cultural variations? And that's actually kind of a follow-up to what you were just talking about.
I didn't have enough space to include all the nuance in this because it's more complicated than just world religions. For instance, those water temples in Bali are very regionally specific. They're a local development, very adapted to that environment. So if you look within religions, you'll have a tremendous matrix of different regional responses and strengths. So I did try to consider that to some extent. One of the challenges of this is I almost backed out when they asked me to do the world religions in a world framework, is how much to cover of different religions and how specific to be. And it still has the problem of being very eclectic. Now, I have tried to pick really good examples from religions, and I've tried to give at least passing coverage to groups that are also often left out, which would include alternative religions in the US, including Wicca and the current paganist community.
So this is a very good point because, you know, as you began your talk talking a little bit about how the ways that we choose our material for these texts shapes, you know, the future of how people interact with the topic, which can shape the response to it. So I can hear in what you're saying now a sense of responsibility there on the part of the author as well. Okay, so we are taking questions from the audience. Please post them in the live event Q&A. We do still have a few minutes for questions. I'm just waiting for my feed to load. So Dr. Bratton, I'm going to ask a question since I can now at this point. What is one of the most, let's say, surprising discoveries you've made as you've been working in your research in recent years, and as you've been trying to uncover ways to talk about your topic?
Ooh, that's a hard question. I'll say one of the best discoveries, or one of the best impressions I have, is the quality of some of the research being done by the current generation, which I think is much better in terms of its cultural sensitivity than the work that was being done in the 1980s. That I've seen a stack of good, really good quality studies, book length studies that have been carefully done, that I think are even-handed. The bias is down. People aren't totally defensive. People are showing respect to the communities they've studied. Or in the case of things like the macaw whaling, the voices are coming from the communities. They're not just academics from hither and yon kind of looking in from the outside. And that's something that when I was, you know, in writing as a single author, I can't really provide myself. I have to kind of divert the readership back and tell them to go look at some of these other materials and read it from the perspective of the people who are actually involved or have a more direct stake in the cases in question.
That's a really good point. So I do have a question in the Q&A. There's some curiosity about your time at UT Dallas. You said that you had been doing a little bit of the work before you made the choice to come here. Why UT Dallas, and what was your time here like?
It was a different world at UT Dallas then. It wasn't quite as well landscaped. It was a close commuting distance from where I was living. The truth of the juncture is that I had Lyme disease really badly. And I was afraid I wouldn't be able to continue in the field scientifically. I'd already had a background in humanities, and decided that while I was trying to heal up, that I would do something that would improve my academic credentialing and would give me something to work with that might not require some of the that wouldn't require the physical condition that the backcountry work I had been doing would require. So there was a little bit of a forcing factor in me getting involved. I think it was a great choice. That even though it had a little bit to do with what was regionally available easily and would cause the least strain for me, I think I had a great time, and I worked on a Holocaust-related topic. And that's something that was really good for what I'm doing right now. It might not seem like it's directly Holocaust-related, but the chapter on urban planning, again, has a discussion of Islamic, Christian, and bias against Jews, and various biases of different groups against each other in urban planning, which is very much a contemporary issue. And again, breaks up the cooperation concerning environmental problem solving.
Do you have a favorite professor from your time here?
Oh, of
or
course.
Couple?
Professor Hofstad.
Oh, yes. She's many of our favorites.
Yes, Gerald Soliday kept me out of trouble. It's a tougher problem than supervising me in class. But
that's great. Thank you. Okay, more questions from the audience. I am ready for you. You know, there's this question, the question from Sophia about indigenous cultures and colonialism makes me think about the effect of colonialism in other global spaces. And what are you seeing there in terms of, are you seeing similar effects on communities in other colonial situations?
Well, it actually strongly affected groups like Smith in India and in Africa. Colonialism changed economies for world religions too. It certainly did for many Islamic countries, and we're still seeing the effects of that today. In fact, it's underlying a great many environmental issues.
Right, that's a very good point. So there's a reminder in the Q&A that our program will be ending shortly, and if you have any final questions, please post them in the Q&A.
If I could mention something else just here for a minute, there's more than just interreligious difference sitting behind environmental change right now. There is an argument among academics, and it has a lot to do with whether you take postmodernist views or not, as to whether religions that have strong organizational structures, and this would include religions like Christianity and Islam, are effective environmentally or not. And there are two sides to that argument. One of them is more of an internationalist view that religions that have these hierarchies and are very established, they have educational networks and so forth, are much better able to transcend boundaries and can show international leadership more easily in cases like climate change. And then there's a counter argument that many of the deep green religions are somewhat anti-structural, that they want to undo those kinds of organizational structures and they want change at a faster rate. So I think it's one of the more exciting discussions going on that concerns the current importance of religions on the world environmental scene and how they best function, whether they should be structured, they should be working with governments, national governments, or whether they should be taking an anti-structural approach.
Are you seeing a trend in either direction, or is it really still the kind of big, deep question happening?
I think I'm not seeing quite enough discussion based on sociological and anthropological data. There's some good papers out there, but I think we haven't looked at it enough comparatively. And I think sometimes we're leaving the issue of modernity hanging. For instance, in the publication of Laudato Si, some early critics of the Pope's encyclical held it to be anti-modern. But this is a much more general problem concerning how religion should interact with environmental science or with environmental issues in general, including things like urban planning. And I don't think we're having enough discussion over that and how religions adapt, both in governmental terms and in technological terms, to modernity.
Excellent. So that's a call out there to all the budding PhD students, right?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Bratton, so much for sharing your time, talent, and your resources. It's been lovely to meet you. And it's been so great to learn about all of the work that you're doing, and I look forward to reading your book. I would like to thank the audience for coming today, and we hope to see you at August's Comet Corner session, which will feature Dr. Stacy Boland, who is a Bachelor of Science from the year 2000. You will see an announcement in a moment in our Q&A for the link to view the complete series and to register, and you'll get the link for the team's live event. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great afternoon, everyone.